This is our kitchen bin and we really like it because it looks good and it fits the space perfectly. Unfortunately though, don't eat that. Spit it out. Unfortunately though, we can't use it anymore, and that's because of Mickie the cat. Mickie is an ex-street cat, and so he is extremely obsessive and compulsive when it comes to food. At first he started tipping the bin over and then getting inside, so I cast a bit of concrete in the bottom of the bin to weigh it down. Then he started scratching at the side of the bin bags, ripping them to shreds, which made emptying the bin really quite unpleasant. So he started leaving the bag inside the bin, which was pretty inconvenient and annoying. But then he learned how to open the lid of the bin and he'd get in and start eating things that he shouldn't eat and get messy, meaning he had to have a bath. Luckily though, we thought, this bin has a pet lock on the front, so we decided to just use that. But now and again we'd forget to lock it and Mickie would get in again. And then one day I heard him trying to get into the bin, so I came through just to double check that it was locked, and it was. So I thought I'll just let him get on with trying to get in, thinking it was nice and secure. But I came in here again 5 minutes later to find that the bin was unlocked, which means he's actually now figured out how to unlock the pet lock. So then we tried putting a heavy weight on the bin lid. We just needed to lift it up every time we wanted to use the bin, but he eventually started trying to push the weight off the bin lid. That seemed potentially quite dangerous, especially if Hazel, our other cat, was nearby. So we started looking at all sorts of options for new bins in shops and online. There are bins that fit inside cupboards, but they tend to be really quite small and I don't want to be emptying a bin that often. And also both me and my wife don't really like touching bins at the best of times, which is why we bought a pedal operated bin in the first place. So we simply couldn't find a purchasable solution to this problem, so I decided that I'd need to make one instead. I've got a lot of MDF at the moment, so that's what I'm going to make use of. Starting with a piece of 12mm, I'm going to make what will be the front door, but I want it to be nice and lightweight, so I decided to rip this into some 50mm strips at the table saw so that I can basically make a frame. I then cut a bottom panel which I want to be quite heavy, so I used some 18mm for that, and then I glued and screwed one of the strips to the front edge of the bottom panel. And I'm going to use some of this 6mm MR MDF for what will be the front door panel. I can then glue on the first component of the frame to the inside of the door panel, but I want to space it up from the bottom by 63mm. Then I can frame out the rest of the inside of the door, which is going to add rigidity while keeping it lightweight. I took some 63x38mm timber or 3x2 and cut 4 short lengths that will become my hinge components. And those are going to pivot on this piece of 28mm dowel that I have. I drilled a pilot hole using the pillar drill just to make sure my holes are nice and straight. These holes will help to direct a 28mm spade bit, which is what I'll be using to drill out the holes. Drilling from both sides in leaves me with a nice clean hole. The dowel fitted nicely, but it felt a little bit tight, so I did a bit of hand sanding, as it needs to be able to move freely. This here is what the inner part of the hinge assembly looks like, and I made a mistake here which I'll explain later, but this is probably a good time to let you know that I have plans available for this build, just in case it's something that anyone else wants to make. Maybe you too have pesky pets that won't stay out of the bin. You'll find links to the plans in the description box. Also worth mentioning that all channel members get free access to all of my plans. There are over 20 in total. I used more 18mm MDF to cut some bracing pieces. These are square and the same width as my bottom panel, and I chopped off the corners at 45 degrees. These get secured with glue and screws through the bottom panel, but I'm just going to use pin nails at the front, which will be easier to fill and hide later on. And the whole cabinet is going to get primed and painted. I'm using acrylic undercoat. I've had great experiences with the combination of paint that I'll be using in this video in terms of durability. If you want more detail on that, I'll leave a link in the description box below to a video that explains it. I'm going to use some more 18mm MDF to make the carcass, again because I want it to be heavy in comparison to the door. These are my side panels, and I want to add a plinth that's set in from the front edge by about 40mm, and I'll fix this in place with dominoes, but dowels or even screws would work well here too. These hinge components need rounding over at the ends, so I just found a round thing, drew around it and cut it out at the bandsaw before sanding it nice and smooth. It doesn't need to look perfect as it'll never be seen, it's just to make sure that the hinge has enough relief in order for it to pivot. It's still fitting a little tight, but this will wear down after a bit of use, so I'm not worried about it, and I added a little bit of wax later off camera so that it wasn't squeaky. After priming and waiting for it to dry, I sanded away excess filler and denibbed using 240 grit, which is going to prepare the edges ready for paint and keep everything smooth. And then the first coat of hard-wearing eggshell. Right, I've been going back and forth a few times on how best to assemble the inner piece of the cabinet with the carcass. Originally, my plan was to install 2 of these hinge components to the inner part and 2 to the inside of the carcass. And to do that, I'd have needed to clamp some spaces in to hold the carcass side panels together at the right distance apart without actually gluing anything in place. And I'd need to prop up these cabinet hinge parts onto some blocks to get them to where they need to be. But there were 2 issues with that. Firstly, I think it would have been difficult to get the door on the inner part aligned properly to the carcass and get all of my gaps around the door consistently spaced. And secondly, I'd be securing these quite thick 38mm hinge blocks to only 18mm MDF. So to get the strongest connection, I'd really have to screw from the outside in. There is plenty of gluing surface here, so perhaps I could have just glued and clamped it in place, but I want this bin to last, and the bins are going to have a reasonable amount of weight on them, so some mechanical fixing seems like a good idea. So then I thought, if I'm going to be screwing these in from the outside, why not glue the front plinth in place first, add all the hinge components to the inner part, get it positioned where I want it, and then drive the screws in to pull the outer part of the hinge onto the inside of the cabinet. And that was what I decided to do, but honestly, I'm still contemplating getting a spreader clamp in here to take this apart, as this glue won't have fully set yet, and doing it the other way. But I'm sure that there are probably other ways of assembling this that make even more sense, as projects with moving components have never really been my forte. So I wanted to ask you, the viewers, how you'd have tackled this. Please let me know down in the comments. I decided to go ahead with my original idea in the end. So here I'm adding the 2 carcass hinge components onto the dowel of the inner component. And before I assemble, I noticed that the panels were not sitting square. In fact, it was way off, so I clamped it down to my plywood squares to pull it into where it needs to be. I thought a dry assembly would be a good idea, so I brought in my inner component and get the door spacings and alignment looking good. And then cut some spaces to assist with assembly and clamp them in place at the back of the carcass. This particular spacer is going to come back to haunt me shortly. I added some thin shims underneath just to make sure that nothing would bind, and then I marked around the carcass hinge locations. I can then remove that inner component again and sand away the primer in the area where the hinge components will be secured so that I get good adhesion with glue. I need to be careful with the glue around the dowel, as I don't want to accidentally glue the dowel in place. Then I can reposition everything in the same way again. For the screws, I drill a countersunk pilot hole, and then I widen the hole just through the MDF alone, because I want to make sure that the screw bites into the hinge component rather than the MDF, so that it pulls it in tight to the side panel.
and this worked really well. Oh, and if you don't like the sight of blood, look away now.
See that? I was just adding the screws on this side, and the piece of MDF that was clamped up there came down and clocked me in the head.
I know it looks a bit barbaric at the moment, but honestly later on you'll never see these screw heads. You'll see here I'm sighting down the gap just to see when those hinge parts are pulled in tight to the panel. And then I can flip the unit over just to double check, and it looks good. Then I can test the opening, and here's where I found a mistake that I'd made. It was opening, but not quite as far as I expected it to.
So I did say earlier that projects with moving parts were not my forte, and this is proof of that. The rounded hinge components were meant to be the ones that were attached to the inner part of the cabinet, and the square hinge components were meant to be attached to the carcass. Having said that, now that I can see the mechanism working, it's quite obvious that both needed rounding over. So if you're going to make one of these, that's what I'd recommend to do.
So it was multi-tool to the rescue here. I had just enough access to get in there and make a relief cut to enable the door to open up a little more. I'm just cutting a small notch so that it clears the plinth. And again, no one will ever see this. I bought a couple of 50-litre bins. I got these from Wilkinson's, and they came with lids, but I'm not going to need those. But if you make one of these cabinets, you should find that it fits most 50-litre bins. I'll leave more detail in the plans. I get some filler in to hide those screws, and it's going to shrink a little bit, but I can always top it up again later. Next, I routed out a rebate so that I can fit a back panel. But before I fit that, I'm going to use some hanging basket chains that I had laying around to set how far I want the door to swing open. I thought this was going to be easier than it turned out to be. When I first fitted the chains, there was lots of binding and rubbing together. I added a little spacer block, a piece of dowel with a hole drilled through it, and that seemed to resolve the issue. Then it was on to making a back panel with more 6mm MDF and a top panel using more 18mm. And I added a nice round over to the top. I needed to round over the edges of the back panel to get it to fit the rebate. I used dominoes again to fit the top panel. And then glued and pinned the back panel in place. I have lots of kitchen handles that a retired kitchen fitter gave to me, and as this cabinet is quite wide, I chose the longest handle that I could find. With the filler now dry, I sand away the excess, and then it's onto the final primer and paint coats. Here's where the screws were, so you can see they've completely disappeared now. And I bought some of these nail-in gliders just to space the cabinet off the floor so that it doesn't get wet when mopping the floor. So we have this kitchen island with a big overhang, originally designed for some extra stools that we never ended up buying, and I designed the bin cabinet to fit under here. Obviously this cabinet fits 2 bins, so the first is for general waste, so I popped a bag in, and the second bin is for recyclables.
So it's now a couple of days after I finished the project, but I just wanted to update you on a couple of changes that I've made. Firstly, you might remember earlier in the video, my back panel didn't extend right to the bottom, mainly because it was going to be pushed up against a wall, and I thought it might be useful to have access from the back later on for cleaning the inside of the bin cabinet. However, I forgot that the island doesn't extend all the way because of this overhang at the side, so Mickie was able to squeeze into the tiny gap and rip up the bin bag again from the inside. He couldn't get into the bin, but still it was a bit of a fail, so I ended up extending the back panel with another piece of 6mm MDF, and that has solved the issue. Secondly, once or twice I found that the chains were still binding a bit, so I ended up replacing the chains with a couple of shoelaces, which runs through the inside here, and that has been working great too. I'll probably find a better solution to this at some point, but for now it's working fine. Thanks for watching.